You can see this especially with this concept of segregation, which is where the races are separated by law. As far as our essential question is concerned, how is urban life different from rural life? Well, for African Americans, whites are going to use this racism to really actually pass laws to restrict black power, and it's going to be legal because courts will permit it. This concept of separating the races by law is called segregation, and it's designed, its very essence is to keep African Americans from rising up to full equality with whites. And this is not something that is simply limited to the South. You need to know that this does exist in the North in some places. It is a widespread phenomenon. And the different kinds of segregation that take place in America, they're often called Jim Crow laws. And what I want you to understand here is that segregation is the split itself. So think of it like those signs that you would see, like whites only on water fountains, right? And you might see back in the time, back in the day in the 1950s, 40s, 30s, 20s, 10s, early 1900s, it might say colored. By the way, this is an incredibly offensive term. For those of you that don't know, it is not a term that should be used at all. It's a racist term. Calling someone who's an ethnic minority colored is not at all an appropriate term. But this split, where you might see a whites-only restroom and a colored-only restroom, that's an example of segregation. And the laws that existed in states that said this is what it is, those laws themselves are called Jim Crow laws. So a Jim Crow law isn't the actual segregation, it's the law that says white people can use the nice bathroom, black people have to use the crappy bathroom. That's the actual law, a Jim Crow law. That's the law that prevents that equality. Why is this allowed? Why are we allowed to segregate races, to separate races? Why are we allowed to pass Jim Crow laws that segregate people in many different ways? Because there was a court case in 1896 called Plessy versus Ferguson, which says that it's okay to separate people. A man named Homer Plessy, this image over here, this image is actually often widely confused to be Homer Plessy. It's not, actually. The man's name is PBS Pinchback. He actually was the first African-American governor of Louisiana. But his appearance is what we're looking at here. Pinchback was an African-American, according to Louisiana standards, by someone who would have been called, at the time, what was known as someone who was an octoroon, someone who's 1/8 black. So if we're going to see here, Pinchback would be down here, and he'd have white parents and white grandparents, but one of his great-grandparents somewhere along the line would have been African American. And Homer Plessy is the same way. Homer Plessy himself is an octoroon, and he agrees to test this idea of segregation by looking at a Jim Crow law, which banned the ability of whites and blacks to share train cars in Louisiana. And this actually was a planned court case. The railroad itself was losing money because it couldn't afford to have both white cars and black cars. So it said, well, let's find a guy who looks white. And that's why I chose Pinchback's picture, because you look at him and he does not necessarily appear to be black or white. He just is kind of who he is, right? You could mistake him for someone who might be white. Maybe you might think he's black, but Plessy looked the same way. There's no known photographs of Plessy out there. And Plessy ends up coming in and buying a ticket as a white man sitting in the white only car. He's immediately arrested when he identifies himself as an octoroon, when he identifies himself as black, and they sue. The court case, it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court of our country, and the Supreme Court says, you know what, Louisiana has the right to treat whites and blacks as separate, as long as they're treated as equal. This is a really important concept. I want you to circle it in your notes. It's going to be crucial. And so what you're going to see here is that states across the South, whether it's Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, etc., they will all embrace Jim Crow laws and make it incredibly hard for African Americans to vote, to exist in full equality with whites by separating them out. And it's the Plessy versus Ferguson court case, which says that it's okay to segregate whites and blacks as long as facilities are separate and equal. And we're going to keep blacks out of power. We're going to keep them from making change by denying them the right to vote, by denying them the ability to challenge these ideas. For example, by putting into place things like what we have here, a poll tax, which is a tax that you were paid before you could vote, usually way more than African Americans could afford. So, for example, a poll tax might look like this. Here's a receipt for a poll tax that you might see. For example, in 1896, it costs you, in this case, $2.50 in order to vote in Birmingham, Alabama. And if you think, well, what's the big deal, right? Like $2.50 in Alabama, that's not a big deal. Well, if you take a look here of what this was worth back in 1895, $3 in 1895 is actually like $70. So if you wanted to vote in Alabama in 1895, 1896, you had to have an extra $70. Sharecroppers don't have that money laying around. They don't have that extra $70 that they can put to vote. And even if they did, that's maybe one vote for an entire family of African Americans where you might have 2 or 3 eligible voters. So you're limiting greatly African Americans' ability to vote with things like the poll tax. When we add into that, of course, the terror of lynching, and you really get a serious disincentive for blacks to vote who see no reason to fight back against this system and risk death.